Hello, it's Bible Scribe again. Thank you for joining me. This video is about Luis Alcazar. He was a Jesuit priest in, I believe, the 1400s. And a lot of people, especially those who want to discredit preterism or a preterist viewpoint, a historical viewpoint of Christ's first coming, they will say that Luis Alcazar, the Jesuit priest, was the one who started the viewpoint of preterism. And so we're going to look into that in this video. And I have a slide deck we're going to go through to kind of explore this. Did Luis Alcazar start preterism? So this all had to do with the Catholic Counter-Reformation. So you know who Martin Luther was, and he was part of the Protestant Reformation. So he and his followers started to break away from the Catholic Church because of the corruption and the control they exerted over the scriptures and the way they oppressed the people. There were a number of reasons. So out of that came the Protestant Reformation, started by Martin Luther. And so what the Catholic Counter-Reformation is was the Catholic Church's attempt to counteract what was going on with the Protestants and bring power and control and authority back to the Catholic Church. So the Protestant application of the Bible's prophecies regarding the Antichrist to the Roman Catholic Church. They were trying to take these prophecies that were... So what was happening is the Protestants were starting to see the Catholic Church as the Antichrist, the Pope as the Antichrist, and the Catholic Church as the evil, the beast nation, or, whatever. And so, they saw that as in their time. The Pope was the Antichrist. It was happening in their time, this end times eschatology they had, and that the Catholic Church was the vehicle. So, of course, the Catholic Church tried to counter that with the Counter-Reformation. So that's what we're going to be talking about. Luis Alcazar was part of this Counter-Reformation by the Catholic Church to fight against the Protestants. So, Luis Alcazar, 1554 to 1613. I may have misspoken earlier, but it was 1554 was his birth. So, lived at the end of the 16th century. And historically, preterists and non-preterists have generally agreed that he wrote the first systematic preteristic exposition of prophecy. And that was called the Vestigatio, arcani, sensus, and Apocalypsi. So that was fun to say. But and notice the date on this. It was published in 1614, which would have been a year after he died. All right, so let's just at least keep that in our frame of reference. That is a little strange. Like, he wrote this paper, and then the Catholic Church picked it up and published it out so that the populace would get this, but it was done after he passed away. Very strange indeed. But, and I would agree that perhaps, and I'm not saying I totally agree, but perhaps Luis Alcazar did write the first systematic historical exposition of prophecy. We don't see any systematic historical exposition of prophecy in any of the church fathers. Nobody really did a systematic exposition of the prophecy other than a few, maybe Hippolytus. He did a lot of work on Antichrist and things like that. Anyway, definitely no other historical exposition of prophecy before Luis Alcazar. However, that doesn't mean, just so you understand where I'm coming from, that doesn't mean I side with Luis Alcazar on his exposition. As we're going to see, we're going to go into it, it's not going to make a lot of sense, and it does not reflect necessarily a modern preterist eschatology in any sense. So let's continue. The Papal Roman Catholic Church commissioned Alcazar and another Spanish Jesuit priest to develop interpretations of prophecy that would take the heat off of the Pope, who was feeling discomfort because the Protestant Reformers were talking about the Papacy as the Antichrist. All right? The whole idea of this Jesuit impetus was that if the Antichrist had been fulfilled in the past, then they could not tie, the Protestants couldn't tie it to the papacy. So they were going to try to make some interpretations that would take the heat off of the Pope. All right? So look at Luis Alcazar and another Spanish Jesuit priest. I actually didn't go into who that other one was, but we may have a clue in the next slide. Francisco Rivera, also in that time frame, 1537, I believe this is the other one, to 1591, another brilliant Jesuit priest and doctor of theology from Spain who put the Antichrist into a future 3.5 years. Okay, so he, instead of Alcazar, which put it in the past, another Jesuit priest at the same time put it in the future. So they had these two competing ideas with which the people would just be, hopefully by their estimation, totally confused and not know what is what. And they definitely wouldn't, if they picked either of these eschatologies, would not blame the Pope for being the Antichrist. His explanation, Ribera's, was that the prophecies applied only to a single sinister man who would rise up at the end of time. Rome quickly adopted this viewpoint as the church's official position, note that, on the Antichrist. In 1590, he published a commentary on Revelation as a counter-interpretation to the prevailing view among Protestants, which of course identified the papacy with the Antichrist, the Pope as the Antichrist. So at the same time, Luis Alcazar is writing an interpretation of prophecy that pushes everything to the past. Rivera is writing one that pushes everything in the future. They were trying to grab as much of the public's attention as possible and push it away from the Pope. So you can see from this that the whole thing was a charade anyway. So let's continue. There was also at this time a cardinal named Robert Bellarmine of Rome, 1542 to 1621. And during this time, he agreed with Rivera, the futurist, in his work concerning the points of the Christian belief against the heretics of his time. The futurist teachings of Rivera were further popularized by this cardinal, Bellarmine, and the most renowned Jesuit controversialists. His writings claim that Paul, Daniel, and John had nothing whatsoever to say about the papal power, and this futurist school won general acceptance among the Catholics. So it's almost like Luis Alcazar was going to do his, and then Rivera was going to do his, and then they were going to see which one caught fire, right? This was how the Jesuits were planning to take back a fight against the Protestant Reformation with this Counter-Reformation, and that was by just trying to sway public opinion. They didn't care whether they picked one or the other, but as long as they picked one, and because the futurist teachings gained popularity, they made that the official Roman Catholic position. They didn't care whether it was right or not, but the futurist position became, at that time, the Roman Catholic position. So, to go back to Alcazar, because we want to see what some of his views were that people say are so preteristic and so that match the preterist viewpoint so well. Well, he did say in Revelation chapters 1 through 11 that Revelation was describing the rejection of the Jews and the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. Now, I might go along with that somewhat. However, I would say, like, what about the churches in Asia? That doesn't have anything to do with the Jews necessarily or the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. I can only assume that's a summary statement. So, I'll ease up on that one and give that away. Maybe Alcazar's views of Revelation chapters 1 through 11 was similar to a modern preterist viewpoint. Perhaps. And then that second point, Revelation chapters 12 through 19, he saw as an overthrow of Roman paganism and the conversion of the empire to a church. And this is wrong. What we see in Revelation chapters 12 through 19 has almost zero to do with Roman paganism. What it has to do with is the Jewish nation, and especially in Revelation chapter 12, the Babylon, Mystery Babylon is Jerusalem, and the arraignment of the priests is talked about in that chapter. The gold linen, the fine gold, purple linen, and gold, and all that. It was talking about the raiment of the priests of the Jews. So he's got that all wrong. The views he has on generally Revelation 12 through 19. Then he saw the two witnesses in chapter 11 of Revelation as the first witness being the doctrine of Christians and the second being the holy lives of Christians. Well, that's not anywhere near a preterist viewpoint. I don't know any preterist that believes that. I don't know any futurist that believes that. So that part of his doctrine was completely off the wall. Revelation, he said, was the apostolic church, and it was birthing the Roman church. He was trying to say that out of the end of Revelation was going to come the Roman Catholic Church. Of course, this makes sense because his whole modus operandi with doing this was to put the Pope and the Catholic Church in a good light. So he took Revelation and his interpretation wriggled around till he made it look like that the Catholic Church was the outgrowth of that judgment of the Jews, and not necessarily the Christian Church, but just the Roman Catholic Church. And that's not a preterist viewpoint at all. The next point, in Revelation 13, Luis Alcazar felt the first beast was Rome's arrogance. No, he really did. He thought the first beast was a personification of the arrogance of Rome in the first century. That's not a preterist viewpoint. Preterists do not believe that. The first beast was a spiritual power that then took control of the Roman Empire and was allowed to do so by God to be a judgment upon the Jews. And so his interpretation is totally different than a preterist interpretation. Revelation 13, the second beast, Luis Alcazar said, was a personification of Rome's carnal wisdom. Well, that follows along with that last one. It's not a preterist interpretation at all of the second beast. Revelation 17, he said, was about idolatrous ancient Rome. And that is not a preterist viewpoint either. Revelation 18, he said, was about the conversion of Rome to Catholicism. Well, Catholicism didn't even exist in the first century. Preterists definitely don't hold that viewpoint. Revelation 18 was about, again, the judgment of the Jewish nation and the transformation of God's kingdom to Christians, Jews or Gentiles. It had nothing to do with the Catholic Church. And then he would say Revelation 20 describes the final persecutions by Antichrist, who he identified as Caesar Nero, and the judgment. Now, preterists do hold a viewpoint that Caesar Nero is at least connected to the beast. And if you want to use the word Antichrist for the beast, the first beast of Revelation 12 and 13, then perhaps you can make that connection. Perhaps that is similar as far as Alcazar's views to a preterist viewpoint. But then Alcazar goes on, and in the last point there, Revelation 21 and 22, he would describe as the triumph of the New Jerusalem, which he saw as the Roman Catholic Church. No preterist in modern days believes that the New Jerusalem in Revelation 21 is the Roman Catholic Church. So, you can say that Luis Alcazar had a preterist viewpoint, but it doesn't match on almost any of the major points of preterism, at least modern day preterism. Now, perhaps because it was historical in nature, that might have been where the similarity stopped, because that was about all that was similar with his interpretation to modern preterism. Now, I did this exercise because I was curious, well, what did the early church fathers think about the Antichrist? Because I wanted to see, did anyone have a correct either futurist, or did they have consistent futurist or historical perspectives of the Antichrist or the beast. And so it was interesting what I found as I went along. Justin Martyr thought that the Antichrist was going to be in his time. All right? And that was 150 AD. And then Irenaeus, in 180 AD, he thought the Antichrist was going to be in his time. All right? And he even saw he was trying to match up the numbers 666 with different people in his time, and he thought it matched the Latin, the name of the Latin people, the Latinos, and he said that was likely that the Antichrist would come from the Latin people groups. Then Hippolytus, in the third point here, in 200 AD, I read a good portion of his dialogues on the Antichrist, and he kind of was all over the place. He thinks that Daniel's 10 horns are actually future kingdoms, even though Daniel 7:24 says that the 10 horns are kings, not kingdoms. And then he also thought that the woman in Revelation 12 is the church, but it's not. The woman in Revelation 12 is the Jewish nation. And it's very clear in Revelation 12 that that's the case. Then we have St. Methodius of Olympus in 250 AD to 311. He saw a future Roman emperor as being the Antichrist. I skipped Tertullian. He thought the Antichrist was going to come from Rome in his time, which was 250 AD. And then Cyril of Jerusalem, 315 to 386 AD, he felt that the Antichrist was future, and that the Antichrist would seize the power of the Roman Empire and falsely act like Christ. And in that, I give it to him. Maybe he was a little correct in that. And that's exactly what the Roman Empire in the first century did. It's exactly what Nero did. He considered himself God. And the beast, Simon Magus, went around telling people he was the Christ. So the two beasts, so you don't get confused, there's two beasts, Simon Magus being the second, Nero being the human aspect of the first. So, and then Cyril also said that the Antichrist would seduce the Gentiles by magical illusions. Well, that's what Simon Magus did in the first century. And he was the human personification of the second beast, which was a spiritual power. So then we had Cyprian of Carthage, and he said it was going to come in his time. The Antichrist would be in his time, which was about 350 AD. St. Ambrose of 350-ish time period, he saw the Antichrist as future, and so did John Chrysostom in about the 400 range. So what I found when I looked at these early church fathers was that, none of them had a very consistent explanation of the prophecies in Daniel and Revelation. None of them. And so they were all picking their own times or trying to match current events they had, and they didn't know. None of them knew. And you know what? It's okay, because the reality is Revelation wasn't written to them. It was written to the churches in Asia in the first century. So why would they understand it? If they read it like most people do and saw it as speaking to themselves directly, well, then they thought the events were going to happen in their time. And most of them did. Each of them in their own respective time thought that the Revelation events were taking place and they were looking for them. And it's a simple misunderstanding. It's a failure to see who the recipients of that letter were and why they received that letter in the first century. It's an easy mistake to make, and I think Christians throughout history have made it. Some have not made it. Some have gotten it right throughout history. In fact, we're going to see in a second one of those. So, to kind of summarize up, Luis Alcazar, his views were not equivalent to a modern preterist belief. Though he did have a historical view of some of the same things, he was simply trying to take the people's focus off of the diocese and the corruption inside of the papacy. Him and Francisco Rivera, they each, conjured up a different interpretation that probably matched some other historical church father interpretations, one historical and one futuristic, and they tried to sell those to the public, to the populace, to get their minds off of the Protestant Reformation and the fact that they were saying the Pope was the Antichrist. This whole Jesuit game was to distract from the papacy, as we've said. His Alcazar's views of the prophecies of Revelation and Daniel were honestly all mixed up. As you saw as we went through his points, he didn't have a lot of consistency, and he wanted to relate things to the Roman Catholic Church that were written way before the Roman Catholic Church and to people who would have known nothing about the Roman Catholic Church. It doesn't make any sense. Many of the early church fathers also had very preteristic interpretations of the events of the first century. So what I found as I've gone through the early church fathers' writings was that most of them were very consistently in agreement on these things, and that was the destruction of the Jews in the first century in 70 AD, the end of the Old Covenant in 70 AD, and God's judgment on the wickedness of the Jewish nation. So, what's interesting is all of those things are preteristic views, and almost all the early church fathers believed those things. The only thing they were getting tripped up on was the Antichrist view, which I hate to say, but as I go through the scriptures, I don't see it defining a single person as Antichrist and then hammering home, the Antichrist person is going to do this, the Antichrist person is going to do that. We do see the beast in Revelation. We do see the second beast who is there to confound and distract people and claim himself as Christ, and then with magic signs point people to the first beast. That would have been Simon Magus, pointing people to Nero, to worship Nero in the first century. And we do see antichrists, plural, mentioned, but the idea, the conception of a single person that is Antichrist is almost wholly derived from 2 Thessalonians. That one passage, the man of lawlessness, the man of sin. And so I have another video on that if you're interested to go find that and watch it, but I truly believe that the Antichrist single person interpretation was part of Francisco Rivera's views. And as I read his views, that's exactly what he was saying. He summed up those prophecies into a one-man figure. Some of the early church fathers did that too. However, I don't see that very clearly in scriptures. So I believe that's the end of the slides. I appreciate you joining me. I just hope that this shows that Luis Alcazar and Francisco Rivera, the two Jesuits at that time who were tasked with this distortion of prophecy, two different distortions. They were trying to just put out, garbage so that anyone would believe it and take the heat off the Pope. And the Pope was, in their face. You better get this done. And so this is what they were trying to do. The fact that Luis Alcazar's interpretation had a lot of maybe some commonalities with preterism, and that Rivera's had commonalities with a modern dispensational, premillennial perhaps, view of eschatology. Does that mean they're all completely bogus? No, it doesn't have anything to do with that. It was just what they were trying to do at the time to distract people from the papacy. And so I hope that gives some clarity to Luis Alcazar's work. I will have all the links from the stuff that I have gone through in the notes. So give me a like and subscribe if you can. Thanks for sticking with me. Appreciate you. God bless.